Okay, so let's be honest for a second. I think
Yeah.
we're all a little obsessed with tracking our workouts these days, truthfully. But
Have you ever actually stopped to think about, like, are these sports watches actually giving us good information? I mean, is that distance reading on your wrist really telling the truth? So that's what we're going to be diving into today. We're going to be looking at if those sports watches are really accurate. And we've got a couple of research articles to kind of help us dig into this. The first one is from 2020 from the Swiss Federal Institute of Sport. And they took 8 popular sports watches, all the big names like Apple, Garmin, Polar, all those, and they actually put them to the test.
yeah, and I think what's really cool about this study is that it wasn't just some boring old lab setting,
Mm.
They actually took these watches out into the real world, like busy city streets and hilly forest trails, and even a wide open track, just to see how they performed and like the conditions you or I would actually run in.
Okay, so they were really trying to simulate real world conditions. Then that makes sense. But what did they find? Like, what was the result of all this testing? Well, the range and accuracy was pretty surprising. I mean, some of the watches were off by a lot. Like, in some cases, they underestimated the distance by up to 9%.
Whoa, 9%? That's huge.
Yeah.
So like if I thought I just ran a 10K, I might have actually only run closer to a 9K.
Hmm.
And that is a huge difference, especially if you're training for a marathon or something and you're trying to hit specific mileage goals. Why was there such a big difference between the watches, though?
Well, the study kind of pointed to a few things, but a really important one is how these watches actually use satellites to track location. So think about it. When you're in a city, you have all these tall buildings that can block those satellite signals, and it creates this thing called an urban canyon effect.
Oh, so it's kind of like
Yeah.
when your GPS freaks out downtown and thinks you're driving through
Yeah,
buildings.
exactly. And then you get similar problems in a forest, too, because
Yeah.
all the trees and the dense canopy up above, that can also interfere with those satellite signals, and that leads to inaccurate readings.
So basically, city runners and trail runners, be warned. That distance on your watch might not be telling the whole story. But what about running on a track? I would think that would be like the ideal environment for accurate tracking.
Yeah, you would think so, right. And for the most part,
Hmm.
the watches were much more accurate on the track. But here's the thing. Instead of underestimating the distance, a lot of the watches actually overestimated.
Really? So on the track, they're lying to us in the other direction.
Well, it definitely raises some questions. Like,
Yeah.
it makes you wonder, are some manufacturers, like, intentionally compensating for those underestimations that happen in more challenging environments, trying to even things out? I mean, the study doesn't answer that for sure, but it's something interesting to think about.
Yeah, for sure. It really makes you think about how much we trust these devices
Yeah.
without ever really questioning the data they give us. So, okay, we've talked about all this hard data on accuracy, or maybe we should say inaccuracy in some cases, but now I'm curious, what do actual athletes think about all of this?
That's a great question. And luckily, there's another study that looks into exactly that. This one's from 2015 from Stockholm University. And unlike that Swiss study that we were just talking about, which was really focused on quantitative data, this one used more of a qualitative approach. They actually interviewed athletes to
Yeah.
try to understand how they use these devices, what's important to them, and what motivates them.
Okay. So for those of us who aren't like research nerds, what does qualitative approach really mean?
So it basically means that instead of just looking at numbers and data, they were more focused on understanding the athlete's actual experience, like their perspective and motivations and stuff. They wanted to go deeper than just the data and figure out the why behind those numbers.
Okay. So less about the what
Right.
and more about the why.
Got it.
So what were some of the key things they found from those athlete interviews?
Well, one of the really fascinating things that came up was just how important feeling is in training. Like, the researchers actually quoted one athlete who talked about feeling calibrated to their breathing and heart rate. So they weren't just looking at the numbers. They were using the data to become more in tune with their body.
Oh, wow. So they're not just letting the technology like dictate their training. They're actually using it to connect more deeply with their own internal feedback, almost like becoming biohackers in a way.
Totally. It's a really cool parallel. They're using tech to gain this deeper understanding of their own physiology, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And you know what? There's this awesome term that they use in the study that I think captures this perfectly. It's called snot sport.
Snot sport. Okay, now I'm really curious. What is that?
So basically, it describes these endurance athletes who kind of,
Yeah.
they really revel in the struggle of it all. Like, they love the pain and the effort and the feeling of pushing themselves to their absolute limit.
Yeah, I think I get that. There's definitely something satisfying about like a really tough workout where you just feel like
Yeah.
you really pushed yourself. So for these snot sport athletes then, Is the tech not about, like, sanitizing that experience, but more about, like, amplifying it?
Exactly. And it makes me wonder, if you were designing a sports watch, specifically for these not sport athletes, what kind of features would you include? Like, what kind of information would be most valuable to them?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I mean, you had all the typical metrics, like distance and pace and heart rate and all that. But what about something that, like, captures the intensity of the experience, like maybe a burn index or something? That tells you how much your muscles are screaming.
Oh, I love that. Or maybe even like a mental fatigue tracker that tells you when you're hitting that wall, that point where you just want to give up.
Oh, that would be game-changing. Imagine knowing you're at, like, 80% mental fatigue. Maybe that's a sign to, like, ease up a bit or
Mm.
switch to a different workout.
Yeah. It can even go a step further
Yeah.
and give you personalized recommendations based on how you're feeling, not just like some generic training plan.
Right. So instead of just being this data tracker, the watch is more like your training partner, helping you reach your goals, but also respecting your limits and experiences.
Totally. And, speaking of individual experiences, the Stockholm study found that there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to using the data from these watches. Like, some athletes were super meticulous. They would analyze, like, every tiny detail of their workout.
Oh, yeah. Those are the people who have, like, color-coded spreadsheets for every run they've ever done.
Exactly. But then other athletes were much more intuitive. They might glance at the data and get a general sense of their progress. But ultimately, they relied more on their own judgment and how they felt during the workout.
So it's not really about saying one approach is right or wrong. It's more about recognizing that people just have different needs and preferences when it comes to data.
Yeah. And what's important is that the technology is flexible enough to account for those differences. It should be a tool that empowers people, not like some digital dictator.
Right. It kind of makes me think about the social aspect of fitness tracking, too. Like,
Yeah.
sharing our workouts has become so normal. It's almost like an extension of the workout itself.
Yeah, it's true. Everyone loves a good post-run selfie with their mileage stats.
Exactly. But what's interesting is the Stockholm study actually found that a lot of athletes were kind of hesitant to share their data publicly.
Yeah, that was surprising. I mean, you would think in this age of like oversharing and everything, everyone would be dying to compare stats and see who's running the most miles or burning the most calories.
I know, right? But it sounds like some athletes felt like their data was too personal to share, and others just didn't see the point. Like,
Yeah.
they weren't training for external validation or anything. They were doing it for themselves.
Yeah, which I think is a really good reminder that fitness should be about personal growth and well-being, not about impressing others or chasing likes on social media.
Right. It's about tuning into your own body and your own goals and finding what works for you.
Exactly. And maybe there's a lesson here for the tech companies too. Like maybe instead of focusing on all these social features, we need tools that help people connect with their own bodies and goals in a more meaningful way.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about accuracy and feelings and data and even the social side of things.
Yeah.
It seems like maybe there's a shift happening, like a move away from purely data-driven training and toward a more holistic approach. That takes into account the whole person, not just the numbers.
I think you're right. These studies are definitely pushing us to rethink our relationship with sports technology. Like, these devices aren't just about tracking progress. They're about connecting with the experience of movement and the joy of pushing our limits and the satisfaction of achieving our goals, whatever those goals might be.
Yeah. It's like we're moving from a world of data points to a world of feelings and experiences.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us back to that question we were talking about earlier. Like, what if we could actually measure and track the subjective intensity of our workouts?
Oh, wow. Imagine a watch that could capture the feeling of that runner's high or the exhilaration of a PR or even just like the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly executed yoga flow.
Yeah.
That would be amazing. A way to like quantify those feelings that drive us to keep pushing.
Right. It would definitely be a game changer. Like, it could revolutionize how we think about training.
For sure. But even without all those like futuristic features, I think these studies already give us some really practical things that we can apply to our training right now.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about remembering that while technology is a really powerful tool, we have to use it in a smart way and not let it become a crutch.
Right. Don't get so focused on chasing those distance goals on your watch that you ignore what your body's telling you.
Exactly. The data should be there to inform you,
Yeah.
not to control you.
So, takeaway number one. If you're someone who likes to run in the city or on trails, just be aware that your watch might be underestimating your distance because all those signal issues we talked about.
Yep. And takeaway number 2. Even if you're like a total data nerd and you love to analyze every little detail of your workouts, don't forget to pay attention to how you felt. Like, were you feeling strong? Did you struggle? Were you pushing too hard? Or not hard enough?
Right. That feedback is just as important, maybe even more important than the numbers themselves.
Totally. It's about finding that balance between what you're seeing on the watch and what you're actually experiencing.
Okay, and lastly, takeaway number 3. Don't feel like you have to share all your data if you don't want to. Your fitness journey is yours. You get to choose who you share it with.
Exactly. It's not about proving anything to anyone else. It's about you and your own goals.
Awesome. So I have to say, after digging into all this, I'm feeling pretty optimistic about the future of sports tech. It seems like we're moving beyond just basic tracking and into this new era where these devices can actually help us understand our bodies and our minds in a much deeper way.
I agree. Like, imagine a world where these devices can not only track all our physical stuff, but also tap into our subjective experiences, help us connect with that joy of movement and the satisfaction of pushing our limits.
Yeah. It would be like having your own personal coach right there on your wrist.
Right. Guiding you toward your goals in a way that really makes sense for you.
I love it. Okay, so before we go, one last thing to think about.
Okay, shoot.
What if technology could actually measure how intense your workout felt? Like the feeling of effort and exertion. Would that change the way you trained?
That's a good one. Would you push yourself harder if you knew your watch was capturing every bit of effort? Or would you be more likely to listen to your body and ease up when you needed to?
Right. It really makes you think about why we train and what role technology should play in all of that. Definitely something to ponder. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.